Concludes all operations of the emergency alert system. All stations may now resume regular programming.
For expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy.
As the world watches and listens in horror, the peaceful pro-democracy demonstration in China comes to a violent and bloody end.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Wolves hiding nearby, whispering do or die around me. You say your last good night while I get
There is another very important phase of warfare. It has as its target not the body, but the mind of the enemy.
The target of psychological warfare is against the enemy's mind.
It is words and ideas.
The ammunition used by Psy War.
Its mission is to influence the thoughts of the enemy soldier, and at the same time
is expected and encouraged to study foreign languages and the social sciences such as history, economics, and sociology. He must have a broad and sympathetic understanding of all phases of human experience.
gripping at my skin, the walls of night closing.
But the use of this force as an integral part of combat has now taken on new form.
So technocracy in the 1930s claimed to be the science of social engineering, where humans were to be controlled to conform to its twisted dystopian scientific dictatorship. And we are starting to see the rise of the technocrat once again, and their Machiavellian approach, their sociopathic tendencies wrapped up with their lust for power should be worrying to pretty much everybody. However, one social engineering tactic that we see deployed on a daily basis can be best exemplified by a quote from J. Edgar Hoover. It is the function of mass agitation to exploit all the grievances, hopes, aspirations, prejudices, fears, and ideals of all the special groups that make up our society. Everything from social, religious, economic, racial, political, stir them up, set one against the other, divide and conquer. That's the way to soften up a democracy. End of quote. Now, the reason we're talking about this tonight is because the Pentagon was recently compelled to order a sweeping review of clandestine U.S. Psy War operations, specifically the operations conducted through social media platforms. And with all the propaganda I see on social media, I figured it would be a good idea to talk about this. Not only is every argument presented by the establishment or the partisan hacks intellectually hollow pandering, or, a reductive argument void of any introspection. I mean, come on, their arguments are entirely dependent on maximizing virtue, platitudes, and appealing to emotion. The media, social media, all the professional quote-unquote journalists, well, they just parrot state messaging now. And they manipulate the naivete of their audience. It's really crazy. However, there are so many people who dismiss the use of manipulation by governments on those websites too. The war debate is actually a perfect example. It's full-on manipulation, and so many are falling for it. Anyway, the investigation comes in response to reports suggesting that the US military has been creating bogus personas with AI-generated profile pictures and fictitious media sites on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And they were doing this to manipulate social media users. Now, that's not surprising at all, actually. We kind of expected it. But for some reason, psychological warfare and the fact that it's a massive part of military operations, well, it has been relegated to the shadows. And most people refuse to even consider its use domestically. As the U.S. Army's 4th Psychological Operations Group explained in a recent recruiting video, they said that they enable the government to pull the strings, turn everything they touch into a weapon, be everywhere, deceive, persuade, change, influence, and inspire. Yes, of the many weapons in the government's vast arsenal, psychological warfare, or Psy-Ops, can take many forms. Everything from mind control experiments, behavioral quote-unquote nudging, or propaganda. In the 1950s, MKUltra, the mind control program developed under CIA Director Allen Dulles, which was a part of his brain warfare Cold War campaign. Anyway, they subjected hundreds of unsuspecting American civilians and military personnel to doses of LSD. Some of them had the drug slipped into their drinks at the beach, in city bars, or restaurants. However, for Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA hired prostitutes to lure men into a bugged room, where they would be dosed with LSD and observed. As Brianna Nofil explains, and I quote, MKUltra's mind control experiments generally centered around behavioral modification via electroshock therapy, hypnosis, polygraphs, radiation, and a variety of drugs, toxins, and chemicals. So the CIA actually spent more than $20 million on its MKUltra program. Their stated goal was reportedly as a means of programming people to carry out assassinations and, to a lesser degree, induce anxieties and erase memories. The program was shut down, but we should note that there have been a lot of speculation regarding if that is in fact true. Some believe that these experiments and programs just moved under a different name, classification, or whatever the case may be. As one study reported, detainees held in CIA safe houses abroad were, and I quote, literally interrogated to death in experimental methods combining drugs, hypnosis, and torture. This was done in some attempt to master brainwashing techniques and memory erasing, end of quote. On a similar note, the top-secret Montauk project allegedly was working to develop mind control techniques that would then be tested out on locals in a nearby village. How crazy is that? They were actually working on mind control techniques, they tested it on a whole village or town, and then what? They just sat back and took notes on how to perfect it. But you know, trust the governments, am I right? Anyway, despite MKUltra violating ethical norms for human experiments, the legacy of brainwashing experiments continue to live on in US policy. So let's fast forward to the present day, and it's clear that the government, aided and abetted by technological advances and scientific experimentation, has updated its Psy-Ops for a new era. For instance, the government has been empowered to use its ever-expanding arsenal of weapons and technologies to influence behaviors in mass and control the populace. And you know, it's just a short hop and a skip from just a behavioral program that tries to influence how people respond to, let's just say, paperwork, to a government program that tries to shape the public's view about other more consequential matters, like, I don't know, supporting nuclear war maybe. Thus, increasingly, governments from around the world, including in the US, are trying to rely on quote-unquote nudge units to steer citizens in the direction that the powers that be want them to go, all while trying to preserve the appearance of free will. Back in 2014, for example, a fusion center in Washington State, a Department of Homeland Security-linked data collection clearinghouse, well, they inadvertently released records on remote mind control tactics. This was actually the use of psychoelectronic weapons to control people from a distance or subject them to varying amounts of pain. Well, that's always good. Jesus, man. Now, one could say that the quote-unquote medical predicament that we have all been dealing with, well, a lot of people consider that to be a psy-op disguised as a pandemic threat. As science writer David Robson explains, and I quote, fears of contagion lead us to become more conformist and tribalistic. Daily reminders of disease may even sway our political affiliations. Various experiments have shown that we actually become more conformist and respectful of convention when we feel a threat of disease. There is one study in particular that determined that evocative images of a pandemic led participants to value conformity and obedience over eccentricity or rebellion. And you know, when they say daily reminders of disease may even sway our political affiliations, the one thing that comes to mind is the COVID death ticker on CNN. Now that is a daily reminder to keep their cult going. Anyway, this is how you persuade a populace to voluntarily march in lockstep with a police state. Yes, fear is how you get people to police themselves and each other. Typically, this is done by ratcheting up the fear factor, dropping one carefully calibrated crisis at a time, and teaching the masses to distrust anyone who diverges from the norm. Essentially, it's behavioral modification by exploiting our human biological disposition for tribalism when faced with a threat. Now that is some dark stuff right there. However, keep in mind that this is not a new experiment in mind control. And on top of that, if you add in the government's inclination to monitor online activity and police so-called quote-unquote disinformation, well, you have the makings of, it's like a restructuring of reality straight out of Orwell's 1984, where the Ministry of Truth polices speech and ensures that facts conform to whatever version of reality the government propagandists embrace. This quote-unquote policing of the mind is exactly the danger author Jim Keith warned about when he predicted that, and I quote, information and communication sources are gradually being linked together into a single computerized network, providing an opportunity for unheralded control of what will be broadcast, what will be said, and ultimately, what will be thought. Now, recently, with the Elon Musk Twitter news, he said he wants to use Twitter to create a quote-unquote everything app. Now, that's a little too much for me. We need to limit control. No monopolies on public discourse, no monopolies on information. This is really the only way forward. But let me know what you think about that. Anyway, we've already seen this play out on the state and federal level with hate crime legislation that cracks down on so-called hateful thoughts and expression. This really just encourages self-censoring and reduces free debate on various subject matters. They use this methodology to use fear of reprisal against average citizens. If they fear the reaction of the mob, then no one speaks the truth. They conform to avoid confrontation. Again, that is some dark stuff. The manipulation that we see, this is the stuff that really gets me hung up. I can't believe how sinister some of this stuff is. However, the end goal of these mind control campaigns, packaged in the guise of the greater good, well, it's just really to see how far the American people will go, how far they will let the government go in reshaping our country in the image of a totalitarian police state. The government's fear-mongering is yet another key element in its mind control programming. And really, it's a simple enough formula. National crisis, global pandemic, reported terrorist attacks, and sporadic shootings leave us in a constant state of fear. And the thing is, the emotional panic that accompanies fear actually shuts down the prefrontal cortex, or the rational thinking part of our brains. In other words, when we are consumed by fear, we stop thinking. I mean, basically, a populace that stops thinking for themselves is a populace that is easily led, easily manipulated, and easily controlled. Whether it's through propaganda, brainwashing, mind control, or just plain fear-mongering, it works. This fear not only increases the power of government, but it also divides the people into factions, persuades them to see each other as the enemy, and keeps them screaming at each other so that they drown out all other sounds. It is because of this, in this way, that the masses will never reach consensus about anything, and we will be too distracted to notice the police state closing in on us. Yes, we would be too distracted to see it until the final crushing curtain falls. This Machiavellian scheme has so ensnared the nation that few Americans even realize that they're being brainwashed or manipulated into adopting an us-against-them mindset. All the while, those in power, bought and paid for by lobbyists and corporations, move their costly agenda forward. This unseen mechanism of society that manipulates us through fear into compliance is what American theorist Edward Bernays referred to as, and I quote, an invisible government which is the true ruling power of our country. Indeed, it was almost 100 years ago when Bernays wrote his seminal work, Propaganda, and I quote, "We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of people who understand the mental process and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind." End of quote. This invisible government of rulers who operate behind the scenes, the architects of the deep state, to them, we are just mere puppets on a string, to be brainwashed, manipulated, and controlled. Yes, indeed, for years now, the powers that be, these politicians and bureaucrats who think like tyrants and act like petty dictators, regardless of what party they belong to, well, they have attempted to brainwash us into believing that we have no rights, that we cannot think for ourselves, that we cannot make decisions about our own health, that we cannot protect our homes, our families, and our businesses, that we are too stupid to act in our own best interest. And of course, they have also somehow made it politically incorrect to demand accountability and transparency from government. Well, they are wrong. We are endowed with rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. No government can take that away. They may try, but ultimately they will fail. History is littered with failed tyrants. However, some closing advice. The world has gone mad. People have lost their minds, and we should act accordingly. Once again, this is HelioWave. If you like the content, like, comment, and subscribe. Share the video if you want to. If you're in a position to, consider subscribing on Locals or Subscribestar. As always, make sure you disobey those true fascistas, and I do hope you have a good night.